Hey everybody, I'm Seth Brown, and today I'm going to be speaking about why it's important to go deep in the Word because God has a purpose. A few weeks ago, John shared about the 3 reasons why it's important to go deep in the Word, and we've been sharing and talking about this since the coronavirus has happened. And everything that's going on in the world right now, there's a lot of uncertainties, there's a lot of fear, a lot of frustrations, and a lot of other emotions going on. And it's easy for us to take our eyes off of God and really turn our eyes towards those emotions that we have going on, or putting a lot of our energy towards that. It's easy for us to turn to the media and look for answers for this coronavirus. It's easy for us, with the extra time that we have, to spend at home working on projects around the house or busying ourselves, since we may not be going to work every day. And we're really not taking advantage of what God's allowing us to do right now, which is reflect on what He's done in our life, get more time with Him, and spend time with our families. And so one of the things that God has been bringing on my heart through the Word this past week, and through discussing it with mentors in my life, is what is God doing in my life right now. And so that's something that I would like to share with you guys this evening. Now, don't get me wrong. The media and projects are not bad things. It's okay to go to the media and to get information on what's going on in the world. And it's okay to do projects. We all do projects at the house. But what really hurts us is whenever we put those in front of our relationship with Jesus. If we don't spend time with Jesus on a daily basis, and if we're not getting time with Him, especially now during this time, we're not going to realize what His purpose is for our life. So last week I was reading in the book of Esther. So if you'd like to, go ahead and turn to the book of Esther. And it really struck me in what God was doing through Esther's life. So a little fun fact about the book of Esther: God is never mentioned in it, but we can see throughout Esther's life and throughout the overarching story that God was definitely working. So just a little background for Esther also. It's after the Babylonian exile of the Jews, and it's during the Persian rule. So the Persians kicked the Babylonians out, and they're ruling all over. Chapter 1 talks about King Xerxes, and the first part of the chapter talks about how great his empire was and how great he was. And then the second part of chapter 1 talks about him deposing his wife and kicking her out because she refused to come and show off in front of his friends. And so that leads us to the end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, where King Xerxes starts looking for a wife, looking for a new queen. And that's when we get introduced to Esther, the main character in the story. And chapter 2 tells us that Esther was orphaned as a child when her mother and father died, and that her cousin Mordecai adopted her and started raising her as his own. So we see that Esther didn't start off, she may not have had a great lavish life, that she hit some rough spots in her life early on. And then it tells us that after that she was a beautiful woman, and she also was called up to be interviewed, so to speak, to be one of the kings, to interview to be the queen. And so she did that with the advice of her cousin Mordecai, and she was in fact chosen in verse 17 to be the queen because Xerxes was delighted with her. So God brought Esther from an orphaned girl to being taken care of by her cousin, to being brought to the queen of the entire nation. 127 nations is what Xerxes was king over. And so she probably didn't see that early on, what God's purpose was for her, and she still hadn't seen it yet to looking in this story to where she's going to, but God's fingerprints was all over that. And so I want to bring us to chapter 3. And I'm just going to read for us the first 10 verses. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Hammedatha, the Agite, over all the nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down to Haman and show respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. The palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He learned of Mordecai's nationality, and so he decided that it was not only enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes, lots were cast in Haman's presence to determine the best day and month to take action, and a day was selected, March 7th, nearly a year later. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "This is a certain race of people scattered through all the province of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any of the other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's best interest to let them live. If it pleases the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring and giving it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. So there we see that Haman has this, Haman feels disrespected by Mordecai, and so he says, "It's just not enough for me to kill this man. I'm going to kill his entire race." And so Haman goes to Xerxes and puts out what he wants to do. And I'm going to read in verse 13 what those dispatches say. It says, "Dispatches were sent by swift messengers that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be slaughtered and annihilated on a single day." So Haman is getting ready to wipe out an entire nation, and we start to piece together where and why Esther may be in the situation that she's in. Although we can see this from reading it, she's living in it in the moment. So let's go into chapter 4 and see how Mordecai and Esther react to this news that the king, of the decree that the king put out. In chapter 4, when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace while wearing clothes of mourning. And the news of the king's decree reached all the provinces. There was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused. Then Esther sent Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was mourning. So Hatach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hatach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of the Jews. He asked Hatach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. So he also asked Hatach to direct her to the king and beg for mercy, pleading for her people. So Hatach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hatach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the province know anyone who appears before the king and in the inner courts without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out the gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him in 30 days. So Hatak gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Then Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the king's palace that you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at this time, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. And who knows, but if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go to the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything that Esther had ordered. So we see in here that Mordecai brings the issue up to Esther. And her initial response was she was afraid and she was scared of what would happen if she went to the king without being called upon. But Mordecai pushed her in there, and especially in that verse 14 where he says, who knows for such a time as this? You have risen to this royal position for this time. And he's reinforcing her what God's purpose was for her life. He makes that known to her. And so what does Esther do after that? And what does she tell Mordecai to do? Get time with God. Dig deep with God. They fasted and they prayed. And then she came up with the decision that she would do it. And if she had to die, she would die because of it. She wouldn't have came to that conclusion, in my opinion, if she did not dig deep with God and spend time with Him. I encourage you to go into the book of Esther and find out what happens and how God delivers the Jews, but He does deliver the Jews. And so I encourage you to go into that book and see what God does for Esther and for Mordecai and to Haman throughout the rest of the book. So in reading that in my quiet time this past week, it really made me think, what does this have to do with me? What does Esther have to do with us? Well, some of the observations that I made was that Esther was put in a certain place by God. Each one of us, wherever we're at right now, are in a certain position, whether it be a position of authority or not. Most of us probably are in authoritative positions. When she was in that position, she used her influence because of her position to serve God. She fulfilled the purpose that God had given her through that influence. And so this convicted me on plans that I had, specifically in coming to Fort Bragg. So I came to Fort Bragg in January, and my plan was to sort of take a knee from my professional career and ETS out of the Army, so I would have about 7 months here at Fort Bragg, and then I would ETS. And I also was planning to do an internship with the Navigators for 6 of those 7 months. So I was planning on sort of taking a knee from work and getting out of the Army, and also being more involved in full-time ministry. That was my plan, and that's what I thought my purpose was. But God has showed me through circumstances and through His Word that that's not where He has me. Right now I'm involved in a medical unit, and with the things that have been going on with the virus and around our country, we have been very busy. But thankfully, God has put mentors in my life and through His Word to help me realize that you're exactly where He wants you at. And so if you can just take the time to reflect on what He's trying to teach you during this season of life. So one of the biggest things that I felt like God has revealed to me in this looking at why am I in this situation is my situation at work right now. So most of the folks that I'm working with, since we're in a medical unit, are pretty upset that they're at work. They may have those feelings of fear, of frustration for their own well-being with this disease, but also a lot of the selfish feelings that we have that, hey, none of my other friends are at work, or my spouse is at home, why don't I get to be at home and spend time with them? So there's a lot of complaining. We all know that the Army's love language is complaining, but even more so, I'm feeling that in my unit. And so I was reading in Philippians a couple days ago, and I've also been trying to commit these two verses to memory. But in Philippians chapter 2, Paul says some pretty profound things. In verse 14, he says, "Do everything without complaining and arguing, so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people." So that really struck me and convicted me, especially in this time where everyone around me is complaining even more, that the one thing that I could do to stand out is not complain to my coworkers around me and to my superiors above me. And in that way, that people may be able to see Jesus' life through my light. And even if it just poses them to ask the question, how are you so happy, or why are you not complaining or upset, that gives me a foothold to talk about Jesus. And so that's one of the things that God has convicted me on over the past week in getting time in His Word. And I say that because I would not have had those convictions if I had not gotten deep time in the Word and tried to figure out what God's purpose is for my life right now. Time in His Word and time with mentors giving me advice is what's helped me turn to this point. So some of the questions that I just want to close with in asking you is, what is God trying to teach you during this season with the coronavirus, with fear, or with frustrated co-workers? What is God trying to teach you? What is your purpose? What is God's purpose for your life? And then what is going to be your response to God's purpose for your life? That's all I have. Thank you very much.